For nearly a century, the tricolor flag of France had flown over Indochina. It was a vast and profitable colony, encompassing the lands we now know as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French called it their mission civilisatrice, their civilizing mission. They built grand boulevards in Saigon and Hanoi, established rubber plantations, and extracted the region's rich resources. But beneath the surface of colonial order, deep resentment simmered. The Vietnamese people, with a history of resisting foreign invaders for 1,000 years, had never truly accepted French domination. Their culture, their language, and their desire for independence were never extinguished. This was a system built on an illusion of permanence, an illusion that was about to be shattered. The world was changing in the early 20th century. Empires that had once seemed eternal were beginning to show their age. In Europe, the carnage of the First World War had weakened the old colonial powers, both financially and morally. The ideas of self-determination and nationalism, championed by leaders like American President Woodrow Wilson, were spreading across the globe. In Vietnam, a new generation of patriots and revolutionaries was listening. They read forbidden texts, organized secret societies, and dreamed of a day when their country would be their own. The French colonial administration, confident in its power, saw these movements as minor annoyances, easily suppressed. They could not see that they were standing on a fault line. The final push would come not from within, but from without. The Second World War would arrive in Southeast Asia with devastating force, exposing the fragility of French rule in a way nothing else could. The war would introduce a new, more ruthless power to the region, and, in doing so, create a vacuum that Vietnamese nationalists were ready to fill. It was the beginning of the end for the French Empire in the East. The intricate web of control, maintained for decades through force and administration, was about to unravel. What followed would not be a simple transfer of power but a brutal 30-year conflict that would draw in superpowers and change the course of history. This is a story about the fall of an empire. It is a story about the unyielding power of nationalism and the dream of a man named Ho Chi Minh. It is a story of a war that France thought it could win, and another war that America believed it had to fight. Before there was an American war in Vietnam, there was a French war, and the seeds of that conflict were sown in the final, desperate years of an old colonial world. The collapse of French Indochina was not just an end, but a beginning, the start of a new, more violent chapter for Southeast Asia and the world. In 1940, the world was at war. France, the colonial master of Indochina, had fallen to Nazi Germany in a matter of weeks. The defeat in Europe sent shockwaves all the way to Southeast Asia. Suddenly, the French authorities in Hanoi and Saigon were cut off from the Nanon. Their borders, their prestige and authority fatally undermined. For the Vietnamese, who had been taught to see the French as an invincible power, this was a revelation. Their rulers were not gods. They could be defeated. It was into this climate of uncertainty that a new power arrived. Imperial Japan, looking to expand its empire and sever Allied supply lines to China, saw Indochina as a strategic prize. They demanded access. The French governor in Indochina, isolated and without support, had little choice but to comply. In September 1940, Japanese troops moved into the northern part of Vietnam. The French were allowed to maintain their civil administration, but it was a humiliating arrangement. They were now puppets, governing at the pleasure of the Japanese military. This dual power system was a fiction. The real authority belonged to the Japanese. They controlled the ports, the railways, and the economy. For the average Vietnamese person, it simply meant they now had two masters instead of one. The French were still there, collecting taxes and enforcing laws, but the Japanese soldiers were the ones with the ultimate power. This occupation had a devastating impact on the Vietnamese people. The Japanese military requisitioned rice and other resources to fuel its war machine, leading to a catastrophic famine in 1944 and 1945. It is estimated that up to 2 million Vietnamese people starved to death. This tragedy exposed the complete failure of the French administration to protect the people it claimed to be civilizing. The suffering was immense, and it bred a deep-seated anger not only toward the Japanese but also toward the French, who stood by and did nothing. The famine became a powerful symbol of colonial indifference and a potent recruiting tool for the forces of revolution. For the French, the Japanese occupation was a slow, agonizing death of their authority. They had lost face, a concept of immense importance in Asia. They were no longer the undisputed masters of Indochina. Day by day, their power and legitimacy drained away. In March of 1945, with the war turning against them, the Japanese decided to end the pretense. In a swift coup, they disarmed and imprisoned the French military and administrative personnel, formally ending French rule. They declared Vietnam independent under the Emperor Bao Dai. But it was too little, too late. The years of Japanese presence had not just weakened the French, they had created an opportunity for another, more determined force to rise. As the French and Japanese vied for control of Indochina, another power was growing in the shadows. It was the Viet Minh, a nationalist independence movement founded in 1941. Its full name was the Viet Nam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The Viet Minh was a broad front, designed to appeal to patriots of all backgrounds, from peasants and intellectuals to small business owners. Its goal was simple and powerful: to rid Vietnam of all foreign rule, whether it was French or Japanese. The organization's guiding force was a mysterious, wispy-bearded figure who had spent 30 years in exile. He was known to his followers as Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot. The world would come to know him as Ho Chi Minh. During the war, Ho Chi Minh and his small band of guerrillas operated from the remote mountains of northern Vietnam, near the Chinese border. They worked with American agents from the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. The Americans were looking for allies to fight the Japanese, and the Viet Minh proved to be a valuable source of intelligence and assistance in rescuing downed Allied pilots. The OSS supplied Ho's forces with a few weapons and some basic training. For Ho Chi Minh, this American connection was a sign of legitimacy. He admired America's own revolutionary history and hoped its leaders would support the Vietnam's quest for independence after the war. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, it created a sudden power vacuum in Vietnam. The Japanese were defeated, and the French were still imprisoned or in disarray. Ho Chi Minh saw his moment. He called for a general uprising, what would become known as the August Revolution. All across the country, Viet Minh forces, supported by a population energized by the prospect of freedom, seized control of government buildings in Hanoi, Hue, and Saigon. The independent government of Emperor Bao Dai, which had been a Japanese creation, quickly collapsed. On September 2, 1945, on a wooden platform in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence. Before a crowd of hundreds of thousands, Ho began his speech with words that were deliberately chosen to appeal to the West. "All men are created equal," he said, quoting directly from the American Declaration of Independence. "They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed that Vietnam's long struggle was over. A new, independent government was in place, but the great powers of the world had other plans. In the halls of power in Washington, London, and Paris, the fate of Vietnam was being decided, and the wishes of the Vietnamese people were not their primary concern. The declaration of an independent Vietnam in Hanoi was not celebrated in Paris. For France, humiliated by its defeat in World War II, reclaiming its colonial empire was a matter of national pride and economic necessity. General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, was determined to restore French authority in Indochina. He saw the Viet Minh as nothing more than a band of agitators who did not represent the true will of the people. The Allies, who had won the war, agreed to a plan. To disarm the Japanese troops, Vietnam would be temporarily occupied. Chinese nationalist forces would move into the north, and British forces would arrive in the south. The British were tasked with maintaining order until the French could return. In Saigon, the British commander, General Douglas Gracie, made it clear he had no sympathy for the Vietnamese cause. He released and rearmed the French soldiers who had been interned by the Japanese. Within weeks, those soldiers, along with newly arrived French troops, went on a rampage, seizing control of Saigon and brutally cracking down on Viet Minh supporters. The brief period of Vietnamese self-rule in the south was over. In the north, Ho Chi Minh played a delicate game. He negotiated with the Chinese occupiers and even for a time with the French, hoping to find a peaceful path to independence. In March 1946, he signed an agreement that recognized Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, but it was a fragile compromise. The peace did not last. Hardliners on both sides wanted a fight. French colonialists in Saigon and military leaders in Paris had no intention of granting any real autonomy. They wanted to re-establish the old colonial order, pure and simple. In November 1946, after a dispute over customs control in the port city of Haiphong, a French cruiser opened fire on the city's Vietnamese quarter. The bombardment was merciless. Thousands of Vietnamese civilians were killed. It was an act of war, and it destroyed any remaining hope for a negotiated settlement. In December, Viet Minh forces retaliated by launching an attack against the French in Hanoi. The First Indochina War had begun. Ho Chi Minh and his government fled Hanoi and retreated back into the mountains of the north. From there, they would wage a protracted guerrilla war. It was a war of the people, a war of the elephant and the tiger. As Ho famously said, "If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks." But the tiger does not stand still. He will leap upon the back of the elephant, tearing out great chunks of his flesh, and then he will leap back into the dark jungle, and slowly, the elephant will bleed to death. For the next 8 years, the French elephant would bleed, fighting a determined and elusive enemy in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam. By 1953, the First Indochina War had become a bloody stalemate. The French controlled the cities and major roads, but the Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Von Nguyen Giap, controlled much of the countryside, especially at night. The war was costing France billions of francs and thousands of lives. It was deeply unpopular back home. The French military command, desperate for a decisive victory, devised a bold new plan. They would build a massive, heavily fortified air base deep in enemy territory, in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. The place was called Dien Bien Phu. The French believed this base would sever Viet Minh supply lines from neighboring Laos and lure General Giap's army into a conventional set-piece battle, where superior French firepower could finally annihilate it. The French commander, General Henri Navarre, called his plan a mousetrap. He was confident that the Viet Minh, with their limited artillery, would be no match for the fortified French garrison. But it was a terrible miscalculation. General Giap saw the French plan not as a trap, but as an opportunity. He accepted the challenge. In an incredible feat of logistical genius, the Viet Minh began to surround the French base. Tens of thousands of civilian porters, using bicycles and their own backs, hauled heavy artillery pieces, piece by piece, through hundreds of miles of dense jungle and over steep mountains. They dug a network of tunnels and trenches, allowing them to position their guns on the high ground overlooking the valley, completely hidden from French view. On March 13, 1954, the trap was sprung. But it was the French who were caught. The Viet Minh unleashed a devastating artillery barrage on the French positions. The airstrip, the garrison's only lifeline to the outside world, was quickly destroyed. The French were shocked. They had no idea the Viet Minh possessed such firepower, or that they could position it so effectively. The battle raged for 56 days. The French soldiers, fighting with incredible bravery, found themselves in a hell on earth. They were besieged, constantly shelled, and subjected to relentless human wave attacks. The monsoon rains turned the trenches into a sea of mud, filled with the dead and the dying. The French command pleaded with the Americans for air support, even for the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but President Eisenhower refused. On May 7, 1954, the last French positions were overrun. The exhausted, shell-shocked survivors of the French garrison surrendered. The news of the defeat at Dien Bien Phu was a thunderclap that echoed around the world. A small Asian guerrilla army had defeated a major Western military power in a pitched battle. It was a humiliation for France, and it shattered a myth of European invincibility. The battle was over, and so was the First Indochina War. The French elephant had finally bled to death. The day after the fall of Dien Bien Phu, a conference convened in Geneva, Switzerland. Its purpose was to find a peaceful resolution to the conflicts in Korea and Indochina. The defeat on the battlefield had left France with no choice but to negotiate an exit. The major players were all there. France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and the United States. Also present were delegations from the Viet Minh, as well as from the French-backed state of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The atmosphere was tense. The Cold War was at its height, and the future of Southeast Asia was on the line. The Viet Minh, having won a decisive victory, came to the table expecting to see their independence recognized across the entire country. But the great powers had their own agendas. The Soviet Union and China, Ho Chi Minh's communist allies, were wary of provoking a wider conflict with the United States. They pressured the Viet Minh to accept a compromise. The American delegation, led by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, was vehemently anti-communist. Dulles feared that a Viet Minh victory would lead to the spread of communism throughout the region, like a row of falling dominoes. He was determined to prevent Ho Chi Minh from gaining control of all of Vietnam. The negotiations were long and difficult, a complex chess match of diplomacy and ideology. In the end, a compromise was reached, but it was one that satisfied no one. The Geneva Accords, signed in July 1954, brought an end to the fighting. They granted full independence to Laos and Cambodia. But for Vietnam, the solution was temporary. The country was to be partitioned at the 17th parallel. The northern half would be governed by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, with its capital in Hanoi. The southern half would be governed by the non-communist, French-backed state of Vietnam, led by the former Emperor Bao Dai, with its capital in Saigon. This division was explicitly stated to be a temporary military demarcation line, not a permanent political or territorial boundary. The most crucial provision of the Accords was a promise for the future. It stipulated that nationwide free elections were to be held in July 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. The Viet Minh, confident that Ho Chi Minh would win any free election, reluctantly agreed to this arrangement. The United States, however, never signed the final declaration. Washington knew, as everyone did, that Ho Chi Minh would win an election in a landslide. It had no intention of allowing that to happen. The Geneva Accords had ended the French War, but they had also drawn a line in the sand. A temporary division was about to become a permanent and deadly one. The ink was barely dry on the Geneva Accords when the United States began to subvert them. For President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, the partition of Vietnam was not a temporary solution. It was a front line in the global Cold War. They saw Ho Chi Minh not as a nationalist leader, but as a puppet of Moscow and Beijing. The domino theory was the guiding principle of American policy. If South Vietnam fell to communism, they believed, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the rest of Southeast Asia would inevitably follow. Preventing this was not a matter of choice, it was a strategic necessity. France was out, but America was ready to step in. The United States threw its support behind a new leader for South Vietnam, a staunchly anti-communist nationalist named Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was an outsider, a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, who had spent years in exile in the United States. With American backing, he quickly consolidated power in Saigon, pushing aside Emperor Bao Dai and crushing his political rivals. The United States poured hundreds of millions of dollars in economic and military aid into Diem's regime. American military advisors arrived to train his new army, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. The goal was to build a strong, stable, and non-communist nation south of the 17th parallel. As the 1956 deadline for the reunification elections approached, it was clear they would never happen. Ngo Dinh Diem, with full American support, refused to participate. He argued correctly that there could be no truly free election in the communist North. The real reason, however, was that both he and the Americans knew he would lose. The division of Vietnam, intended to be temporary, became permanent. The United States had replaced France as the political and financial patron of a government in Saigon. In doing so, it had also inherited France's war. The line drawn at the 17th parallel was no longer just a demarcation line. It was a Cold War frontier. In a very real sense, the United States was picking up where France had left off. The American advisors who arrived in Vietnam saw a situation that looked familiar. They were training a local army to fight a guerrilla insurgency that was supported by the North. They were propping up a government in Saigon that lacked widespread popular support. They too were foreigners, trying to impose their will on a complex and ancient culture they did not fully understand. The lessons of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu were there to be learned, but America, confident in its power and its righteousness, was not listening. A new and much larger war was on the horizon. The fall of French Indochina was more than just the end of a colonial project. It was a profound historical turning point with lessons that would echo for decades. The most fundamental theme was the unstoppable force of modern nationalism. The French believed they were fighting to contain communism, but for the Viet Minh and the majority of the Vietnamese people, it was a war for independence. They were fighting to expel a foreign power, just as their ancestors had fought the Chinese for centuries. France consistently underestimated this determination, viewing Ho Chi Minh as a mere cog in the international communist machine, rather than the leader of a powerful national movement. This failure to understand the enemy's motivation was a critical and ultimately fatal mistake. The war also marked a significant shift in global power dynamics, from the old world of European empires to the new bipolar world of the Cold War. France was fighting to hold onto its past, its imperial glory. The United States, on the other hand, saw Vietnam through the lens of its future, as a battleground in its ideological struggle against the Soviet Union. When France faltered, America stepped in, not to save the French Empire, but to contain communism. The conflict was reframed. What had begun as a colonial war of independence was transformed into a proxy war between superpowers. The Vietnamese people were caught in the middle, their own aspirations for unity and self-governance subsumed by a larger global contest. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in particular offered a stark military lesson that was tragically ignored. It proved that a technologically inferior, but highly motivated guerrilla army could defeat a modern, conventional military. It demonstrated the power of logistics, popular support, and a willingness to endure immense sacrifice. The French had superior firepower, air support, and armor, but none of it mattered in the end. They were trapped in a valley, their supply lines cut, and their strategy rendered useless by an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. The lesson was clear. Technology and firepower alone cannot defeat an insurgency that has the support of the people. The impact of this period on the region was immense. The creation of a divided Vietnam set the stage for 2 more decades of brutal warfare. The newly independent nations of Laos and Cambodia found their neutrality and stability immediately threatened, drawn into the vortex of the larger conflict raging next door. For France, the loss of Indochina was a painful blow to its national psyche, accelerating the decline of its global empire. For the United States, inheriting France's role in Vietnam would lead to its own national trauma, a war that would divide American society and redefine its place in the world. The ghosts of the French war would haunt the American one. The collapse of French Indochina left behind a complex and troubled inheritance for Southeast Asia and the world. The era's end did not bring peace. Instead, it created a new set of nations and a new set of conflicts. The Geneva Accords, intended to settle the region's future, instead laid the groundwork for a larger and more destructive war. The temporary division of Vietnam became a source of permanent conflict, a wound that could only be closed by force. The independent states of Laos and Cambodia, born from the ashes of the French Empire, were immediately caught in the crossfire of the Cold War, their landscapes becoming secret battlegrounds for the great powers. The legacy for Vietnam was one of continued struggle. The dream of a unified and independent nation, so close in 1945, was deferred for another 21 years. The division of the country hardened into 2 opposing states, each backed by a global superpower. The North, under Ho Chi Minh, was committed to unifying the country under communism, by force if necessary. The South, under a series of American-backed governments, was determined to resist. The result was a civil war fueled by outside powers, a conflict that would claim the lives of millions of Vietnamese on both sides, devastate the countryside, and leave a legacy of bitterness and division that would last for generations. The fall of French Indochina also had a profound global significance. It was a clear signal that the age of European colonialism was over. Nationalist movements across Asia and Africa were emboldened by the Viet Minh's victory. The message of Dien Bien Phu was that independence could be won on the battlefield, even against a powerful Western nation. It inspired revolutionaries and freedom fighters around the world. At the same time, it demonstrated how decolonization could become entangled with the Cold War, with local struggles for independence becoming arenas for superpower competition. The fight for freedom from one master often led to dependence on another. In the end, the story of the fall of French Indochina is a tragedy. It is a story of missed opportunities for peace, of cultural arrogance, and of the catastrophic consequences of viewing a local struggle for independence through a global ideological lens. France lost an empire because it could not see that its time was up. The United States inherited a war because it believed it could succeed where France had failed, without truly understanding why France had failed in the first place. The long, dark shadow of this period would stretch across the remainder of the 20th century, a sobering reminder of how the decisions of the past create the battlefields of the future.